welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We have assembled some of the finest minds of the Southwestern Synod to help us think through some of these Lent readings as we set out across this season of Lent. So, Rachel, where are you going with these readings this week?
Well, I got quite excited actually in my preparation because my theme for the day is God remembers. When I was reading through the Genesis reading, it suddenly struck me that twice it says that when God sees the rainbow, God will remember. And it struck me that it's more of a sign to God than to us. And every time we look at a rainbow and we kind of think, oh yes, you know, God's promises, but it's quite powerful to think every time God looks at a rainbow, God remembers God's promises. So I was going with God remembers because then there was a bit in the Psalm, in the middle of the Psalm, verse 7, Psalm 25, verse 7, do not remember the sins of my youth, but according to your steadfast love, remember me. So I thought I would focus on God remembering, and I'd bring in the passage from Mark, because it begins with God's affirmation of Jesus. We've got because Mark is so brief, we've got the baptism, and then Jesus goes into the wilderness, and then that's about it, isn't it? So I thought I would draw in God's affirmation, and I would ask people what they need to remember today. And maybe people feel like they're in the wilderness or they're among the wild beasts, or just finding things a bit difficult. But just a reminder to people that God has promised to be committed to us, and a reminder of that affirmation that we are all God's beloved children. So that was where I was going.
Oh, I think I had the same revelation, because I don't think I'd ever read that as like a post-it note for God. And then I read it this time, I thought, oh, yeah, hang on, it's actually that's God's giant post-it note to self, don't destroy the entire creation again. Yeah, Ruth.
Yes, I noticed us all nodding at that point, and I blame the song. Down came the rain in torrents, splish splosh, that one, because that has the line, whenever you see a rainbow, remember God is love. And actually, that's not what the Bible says. So this is the danger of songs. Songs drill into your little infant brain, and then whenever you read the Bible, you read what you expect to see there. So thank you, Rachel. Yes, it's good to be reminded that what's actually there is a rainbow-shaped post-it to God. Rather like that idea.
It's I don't know if I find it as entirely comforting as that, in that God needs to be reminded not to completely annihilate the entire creation again. And if there doesn't happen to be a rainbow when God's feeling cross, then are we still in danger? Rachel.
I take that as well, but I don't really need to be reminded that I love my children. But sometimes there are little things that they do that just remind me that I do love my children. Do you know what I mean? So I'm sure that God's got it all in hand, and it's more of an affirmation perhaps than I've forgotten this. I must remember it now.
I don't know if it's fanciful, but I read more than one commentator, so it might be that there's a kernel of something in it, that the rainbow might have been seen as like an archer's bow, a bow, and that it's drawn. It's not drawn, and it's pointing away from creation. Whereas I think the thing when we think about rainbows nowadays, we think about all the colours and everything mixing together, don't we? Maybe say a bit more about that later on. But the image wasn't really about the colours back then. The image was about the fact that it was a war bow, and it's not drawn and pointed towards us anymore. God is not out to get us. It's pointing away from us, and it's not drawn ready for retribution. So yeah, it's quite nice that God is reminded of that. Maybe a bit more to say about that later on. Neil, where were you going to go with these?
Yeah, I mean, I think in not entirely dissimilar territory. I'm struck by the rainbow. I think it's maybe working. I mean, it can work in a sort of a both and way as well as an either or way, in the sense that perhaps it's there reminding God, but because it's visible to us, it's reminding us that God is being reminded. So that's quite a powerful thing. And I think the thing that I was struck by, well, one thing I was struck by was that 1 Peter 3 has an awful lot in it. You know, I mean, there's so much going on in 1 Peter 3 that the challenge of 1 Peter 3 is trying to pick out something. And it made me sort of go back to the Genesis and think perhaps one of the things that I might dwell on a bit is that what that rainbow story is saying in different ways, I think, is it's also a story about God saying to humanity and to creation, I am completely invested in you now. I am linking my whole journey to the journey of creation. So I think that's an incredibly powerful and positive thing to try to pull out, that in a sense, despite all of our chaos and all that can go wrong, God is actively choosing to be on the side of creation and be on the side of humanity. And that's a powerful way in, given this is the first Sunday of Lent, and we're wondering, what does it mean? You know, you've got the baptismal story and Jesus then going into the wilderness. You've got an incredibly dense bit of theology in 1 Peter about what does the cross mean, and how is the cross the center of everything. And I think it would be, I mean, the danger would be you end up with a sermon that's just got so much crammed into it that, you know, it just collapses under the weight of its own intelligence.
That's never a danger with me, Neil.
Well, yeah, I've heard your sermons, Pete. I know what it's like. But equally, maybe at the start of Lent, you know, I'm always struck in the life of the church and in my own life of spirituality, this tremendous tendency to try to leap to Easter Sunday and get there as quickly as possible. You know, I want to be in the resurrection garden. And actually, this is a Sunday at the start of Lent when maybe to dwell on what does it mean that God in the Noah story says, I'm going to hitch myself to humanity, even though you are chaotic. And even though, you know, it would be perfectly reasonable perhaps for me to say, oh, I've had enough of this. I'm just going to go and invent a creation somewhere else. And then connect that to what does it mean that Jesus comes, you know, God's ultimate act of limiting God's self is to say, I'm going to walk as one of you, and I'm going to take that risk, and I'm going to go to the cross, and Lent is that journey. So, I mean, I haven't, you know, there's still too much there, I think, for a sermon, but that might be something that I'd want to try and home in on. How does Lent 1 open up? What does it mean for me, for us as a congregation, to get ready, to move slowly enough towards Easter that we notice things about ourselves and the world and the church, but maybe above all that we notice things about the nature of God. That might be where I'd head.
Yeah, I absolutely chime with that. I think this is about a question: who is God? What sort of God is this? And I think it might also be. I'm kind of toying with the idea of a series across Lent, where next week might be what does it mean to be Jesus? This wrestling in the wilderness, and Maybe that's what the wilderness was about, asking Jesus, saying, what does it mean to be Jesus? I'll take 40 days to work out what it means to be Jesus. And then maybe when we've understood a little bit about what it means to be God, who is God, and what it means to be Jesus, then we can begin to figure out what it means to be his disciples. I detect in this Genesis reading, which it always initially repels me, the story of Noah, but trying to get beyond that, I think there's a tone, it's like an undertone of regret in God here. And absolutely, as you say, Neil, God maybe regretting that whole Noah incident and realizing that's not going to work. And the post-flood world is just as corrupt as the pre-flood world. And it hasn't helped and it hasn't solved it. And God lays down her weapons and says, okay, I'm now vulnerable and weak. And as you said, I think, hitching myself to creation. And as you say, that journey ends at the cross, where God completely hitches herself to creation and says, I've laid down my weapons. Do your worst. I'm still here loving you. Do what you like. Not do what you like. Do your worst. You're not going to drive me off, which is a really powerful thing to say about God, isn't it? Yeah, Ruth.
I was very struck as you were talking there, Neil, about the bow and about the weapons, about God being part of and aligning God's self with creation. I was thinking about what is the contrast, excuse me, the contrast with other deities. I think we always have to read the Genesis stuff in the light of all the other mythology that we know was around at the time, and this was God's people saying, okay, what are we going to say about God that's a bit different from the others? So if you think, I was just thinking about rainbows and storms and stuff, and it's very easy to think when there's a thunderbolt, that's one of the gods throwing down a thunderbolt, and the contrast between that and the God who says, no, there's my bow, look, not pointing at you, not drawn, not playing that game, doing a different game. And I was also reminded that the covenant is with every living creature.
Yeah.
I think there is something there that we would want to say about creation and about our place in creation and our responsibility to creation. Again, I think we say it when we read the first bit of Genesis, but I think it's worth reiterating for people that messing things up doesn't just mess up the world for us, but it actually messes it up. And God says this is a covenant, funny kind of covenant that really God just says that's it. There's a covenant now. Doesn't demand anything of the rest of creation, and so it was just that kind of trying to think what is this story trying to do. I think is a good question, and I really like your reading of it is there so that we're ready for the God who doesn't stand over and judge and send down thunderbolts, but does something quite different.
Yeah, Rachel.
I'm just reminded that they say that it's probably written during the exile. So when we're reading that with the exile in view, just wonder what that does to the story, really. If you feel that God has deserted you, or that God has been defeated, how do you read the story in the light of that? And perhaps, perhaps you might really wish that God would pick up that bow again and, smite your enemies or whatnot. I think the kind of lens of the exile also perhaps allows for a slightly different reading.
Yeah, Ruth.
Well, and I know it confuses people when we start talking about exile and exodus, because they kind of, I get confused sometimes. You have to think, oh no, that's that bit, that's that bit. But yes, the telescoping a bit, the understanding of a lot of what we understand happened over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, but realizing that somebody sat down and wrote it down at one point and was looking over the whole lot. I did find one commentary thing that said that the that God being reminded and God remembering is echoed in the story of the Exodus and the blood on the doorposts at Passover. That is there as a sign to remind God that God's people are in that place. And I find myself thinking, why would God need that? If you're God, then you know which ones are yours and which one. So there's another story that I struggle with. But that lovely bit that's very individual. My doorpost is signed, therefore I'm okay. But the rainbow is everywhere. And if you try to pin down where is it, looking for the end of the rainbow, but it's not in any one place, it's over the whole earth. So I thought there's something, but again, like Neil, I'm ending up with a massive sermon that nobody wants to hear.
You've got the whole of Lent, Ruth. Neil, you were going to come back.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. And something else that's striking me is, not least, thinking about how this got composed, the context in which it was written, is also that decision that was taken to say very early in the whole thread of Scripture, very early in the canon, we're going to encounter this story. We're going to encounter a story of God. So that, it's a bit like, having the prologue of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and then that's kind of the thing that keys you in to everything you're going to read in the rest of the Gospel. And it's kind of interesting to think of this passage, and indeed Genesis 1 and 2, the creation story, and Genesis 3, the fall story, of actually saying, how does this become a key or a lens into which we then travel the whole scriptural journey? And of course, what we then discover is, it's tremendous highs and lows. It's times of great rejoicing, and it's times of devastation. It's times of exile and slavery and corruption and prophecies and prophets being ignored. In other words, it's the chaos that we know. and that there's something, I think, tremendously evocative about maybe helping a congregation with some of these sorts of passages to see how this fits into the jigsaw of the Bible. And I guess maybe especially, and this is a terrible generalization, but on the whole, the research I've read suggests, and the experiences I've had tells me, that on the whole, we're more comfortable in the New Testament than in the Old as congregations. And we find some of this stuff harder to get our heads around. And so actually allowing it to be a lens that helps make sense of the rest of it could be a way in.
Yeah, although weirdly, Noah's Ark is possibly the one story that is universally converted into a children's toy that everybody has played with at some time in their lives.
Yeah,
it's like Rachel.
I just like that idea about this being a text that kind of keys you into the rest of it. And I think you could read, I like all of you, I really don't like the story of Noah's Ark. I can't quite get my head around it generally, but I read one of the commentators that I was looking at said that we can see the bow as an invitation to trust, an invitation to the human race to trust in God. And I think actually, if that were to be my lens to look at the rest of the Old Testament, the rest of the Bible, I think that's quite helpful actually, because in all the shenanigans and all the stuff that goes on, we're invited to trust. And you think of the times in the Exodus where the Israelites were, where they were very impatient and they couldn't, they were frustrated that they were hungry or thirsty or whatnot, and trusting was really hard. And they didn't have a whole load of experience to go on. we've got all these stories written down that kind of gives some concreteness to that invitation to trust, don't we? So I think that's a really helpful idea about keying in to that lens.
Yeah, I've always been in two minds with my preaching on these kinds of texts, as to whether I'm more comforted by the idea that God is normal, and God is capable of changing her mind, and God has regret. I just quite like the idea that God might have regretted this. But then I think, oh, actually, that's not a great thing about a divine being, is it? that she makes mistakes. Or whether I'm more comforted by the idea that this is humans learning about God and tossing around ideas. Oh, maybe that wasn't God doing that, all this. We just assumed it was because that's the way we think God should be, and now we've discovered that God is actually like this. And I kind of probably tend towards the latter, but there are hints, aren't there? And I wonder if, like an Old Testament Jewish God who's a little bit feisty and sometimes capricious, isn't a bad thing compared to this kind of perfect, mysterious being, untouchable being that sometimes we create and make God so unreal that it's very difficult for us to connect with. The other thing I think that comes to my mind with how you might connect that with the exile is Neil needs more for his sermon, is to maybe think of the theme of remnants, which crops up all through the Bible. I wonder if this is the first incident of remnant theology. If only we could take one pure family or one pure community, take it out of that corruption and start again with that. I mean, that happens time and time again, doesn't it? I mean, even in today's world, people think that if you just take one pure community and plant it somewhere, and then you can grow it into the kingdom of God. Time and time again, it doesn't work because the yeast is fundamentally flawed. Yes, Ruth.
Just it was the first bit, though. I love the idea of giving Neil yet more to go in the sermon. but the first bit about, sorry, remind me what you just said, because the second bit distracted me. You can't
I have no idea, Ruth. What did I just say? We'll have to wait for
the tape to come out. You can cut this bit out. Okay, let's think. Can anyone remember what the first point was? It was about. Oh, I know. It was about capricious God. That was
yes.
That was it. And I think yes, it's is it God who's capricious, or is it people who's capricious? And the idea of a God who says the only way of dealing with all of this is to start again and swoosh is in sort of it has an attractiveness, but it doesn't work. So then we get a story like this that says, okay, God's going to do it a different way. But also something that was it that you said about this untouchable God that certainly Muslims that I've talked with about this would say Jesus cannot be God because Jesus suffers, and you could not do that to God. God could not be incarnate. God could not suffer. So I think right at the beginning of Lent, to kind of get that idea out of the way, to say, no, this is the God who says, I'm not that untouchable, capricious, judging from a distance, sending thunderbolts God. I am this God who is in and through creation and can come I can do that. That's the way I can. And indeed, we will say as Lent unfolds and as Easter arrives, that's precisely what God does. So, yeah. Sorry, it took me a little while to pick up what I read.
Spoiler alert, next week, Lent 2, we'll be talking about Peter's engagement with Jesus, when Peter is utterly horrified when Jesus says you can do that to God. So yeah, maybe we'll cover that. The picture that comes into my mind about this, what God has given up, when Neil was talking, because I think God has given something up here, the divine right to destroy what she has created. and start again. And that's the creator's prerogative, isn't it? When my kids used to have Lego, and there's 3 of them, and they made Lego models, and they all wanted the same piece, but the piece that one wanted was buried deep in the model of the one that's the other one had created. The rule was the creator gets to decide what happens to their Lego model. And until Emma wants to destroy her spaceship and Hal can build a giraffe out of it, then it's creator's prerogative. But what God said was, no, you can pull it apart. I'm surrendering my right to just give up the project and start something else, because I've had other ideas and I could start something different on Mars. But God's given up her right to do that. Rachel.
In the light of that, then you could also bring in a kind of environmental slant to your message. If God has given up rights to what happens with creation, what are we doing then with the responsibilities that we've been given?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether there's anything left for Ruth to say, but you might have been going with Mark. So where were you going with these readings, Ruth?
Yes, well, mostly I was going to go with Genesis, but I did linger in 1 Peter. So maybe, because I found myself thinking about sin, as you do. And I remembered it's Francis Spufford's book, Unapologetic, which if people haven't read it, you should. It has a naughty word, which I will replace with the word, I wrote it down to make sure I didn't use
Stuff.
the acronym, to mess things up. Okay, you will find an F word, and he's unapologetic about it. And then he uses an acronym. So if you're offended by that, please carry on reading. So Francis Ackroyd, instead of the word sin, uses the human ability to mess things up. And I think for me that unlocked a whole door of understanding about sin. And then when you say, so we know that humans have an ability to mess things up. Even people who might not be comfortable talking about sin and wouldn't describe themselves as sinners would not say, but I'm perfect. They would say, no, I mess things up. You mess things up. Together we mess things up. We look at the planet, we're messing it up. There's no doubt about that. So I had, for Genesis, I had this sort of image of emerging into the new normal, to use a kind of phrase that might be still in people's memories from 2020. The idea that that we've come out of something and we're going into something and we're not sure quite what we're emerging into. But we know that we will take with us the human ability to mess things up. And that in Genesis, God is saying, tried the well, let's just throw it away and start again. That didn't really work. So now I'm going to do it a different way, in all the ways that Neil has said better than I was ready to say, so that's fine. So then I turn to 1 Peter, and now here's a bit, I'm not a bit comfortable with, and I've got to have the Bible to get it right. You see, the trouble is, we're not careful. We start off with, Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. And we're left with this kind of, how does that work? What does it mean to be put right? How, the classic, Jesus dies to deal with sin, to deal with our sin, to suffer for our sin. It was a number of years ago that I was looking at various Bible bits with people who hadn't really looked at the Bible much before, and it was a great group to be with, and we got to this idea of, and it was somebody else doing the input that day, and had talked about God sending His Son to die for the sins of the world, classic. But one of the mums there got really, really cross and said, "That's terrible. I wouldn't send my child to die for me, or to die to do my job. What sort of God is this?" And just the outrage really hit home. And it was sort of a phrase that I was used to, that I knew I was uncomfortable with, but I'd never quite worked out where the difficulty was. And as we talked, we got to, well, does it help instead to think of it as, we are God's children. God will come and die for us, his children. Oh yeah, that makes sense. I would die for my kids. That's what, when you get your head around Jesus is God come to do this, not sending somebody else. It's the difficulty of our Trinitarian language. I didn't put it that way at the time, but that's where we're at. So then I thought, so what is this doing here? And I realised that certainly in what I'm looking at, and it's the New Revised Standard Version, that verse I just read starts with, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all. And I thought, hang on, we're in the middle of a conversation here. And when you go back, you find that the subheading, I know they're not original, but suffering for doing right. So it talks about don't repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, repay with a blessing, and so on. Then it says, just before that verse where we picked it up, I can't find it. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all. And I thought, so this isn't meant to be a this is how the cross works statement. This is meant to be this is a reflection on suffering and how suffering works and how suffering can do good. And it's one way of understanding the cross. And for me, I kind of felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Maybe I can preach on this, because I hope I can say to people, this is one way, and release them from that burden of this is the way to understand sin. And to preach something much more like what Neil was saying, that this is God in the Genesis, and then it's picked up again in 1 Peter in a slightly different way, saying this is one of the ways in which God, through suffering and not violence, deals with the human ability to mess things up. And that for me kind of, I won't say redeemed a verse of the Bible, because it's me that needs redemption and not the Bible, but you know what I mean. It redeemed my relationship with this part of the Bible. And I hope, if I can preach that, it might help a few other people to let go of, I think, looking for the one way of understanding the cross. Again, that's why we've got the whole of Lent, because there's lots of different ways. We're not going to, there isn't just the one thing. Get that in your head and hold on to that. And I know we're always looking for a simple evangelistic tool to say to people, this is what it's about. But I'm becoming less and less comfortable with the one thing that might unlock it for people, and looking instead for let's find different ways and say this is a way of understanding it, because this is God we're talking about. We're not going to find one way of understanding. That's why we've got the whole Bible with many stories.
The whole Bible and the whole of Lent. Neil.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Ruth. And it's interesting, isn't it? Reading on in the Peter bit, we then get to baptism, and we get to that notion that the Noah story prefigures baptism, but it also that what baptism does is it helps connect us to this story of what God is doing. So there's tremendously rich stuff in there about how these are readings that really, if we want to, take us deep into the very nature of God, but also the nature of our response to God. Yeah, just as the Noah story, for all its weirdness, is also a story about how do people respond when God says, I want you to build a big boat. Do they just say, well, that's stupid, I'm not going to do it? And so we have in 1 Peter, how are we going to respond to the fact that this vulnerable, amazing God has set aside throwing everything away, and instead has decided to enter into the chaos?
Yeah, Ruth.
Yeah, I was just thinking mischievously, I would love to have a baptism on this Sunday.
Yeah.
And either the adult by total immersion, or I mean, I have seen infants baptized by total immersion, really plunged into the water. I would love, and you would have to have parents who are willing to do this if it was an infant baptism, or a person if it was a believer's baptism. But to each time, I mean, we tend to have 3 sprinklings or 3 dippings, or maybe just one very big dipping. But there's always a 3-ness about a baptism, because we're baptised in the name of the Trinity. But I'd love with each of the dippings, or each of the sprinklings, or each of the 3, to say, so this, like the people being in the flood, we baptise you into this water, knowing that God will bring you out, splosh. We baptise you into this water, like Jesus being baptised by John the Baptist, splosh. We baptise you in this water as a sign of entering the church and that you will never leave, splosh. But it was just a fancy. That pulling all of that together somehow would be wonderful in the symbolism of baptism. And yeah, it was interesting to read on in 1 Peter and realise that I think there's a lot going on in that passage of this is like that is like that. It doesn't mean that there's exact equality and only equality with that.
I see a new URC baptism liturgy coming on there, Ruth. Crack on. Crack on. I think it's really helpful because I have to confess, all I wrote in my notes after the Peter passage was, so that's clear then. Because I just kind of came away with the fact that it's just the New Testament isn't really great at making the Old Testament clear. It seems a bit of a stretch to me to say that the flood is a prefigure of baptism. I don't know. I wasn't responding to that, but actually you've helped me make a little bit of sense out of that, and I think that's really helpful. It is the beginning of Lent. It's interesting because quite often we focus on the New Testament. We haven't really focused that much on Mark, but because Mark's very brief, so it doesn't give us that much detail, as Rachel was saying earlier on, to get our teeth into. But I did love the last bit. So Jesus is the Spirit reminds Jesus that he is God's Son and beloved, which is a great thing to be reminded of. Yay, says Jesus, and the Spirit immediately drives him out into the wilderness. And I kind of thought, well, being in the wilderness is not a sign that you're not beloved, is one thing you might take from that. If you find yourself wandering in the wilderness, it doesn't mean that you're not beloved. And secondly, I thought as we begin Lent, we've got 40 days ahead of supposed to be examining ourselves and understanding ourselves, and maybe if we're doing it seriously, getting to grips with who we are in response to who God is. That's what Lent is kind of supposed to be about, I think, isn't it? It's a good thing at the beginning of that to start that period with a reminder that we are loved. Yeah. Wherever our reflections and meditations lead us, they might lead us into dark places over the next 40 days if we take it seriously. How do I respond to this awesome God? It is a good thing right at the beginning to put yourself a post-it note. I am loved. It says so in Mark. Yeah, Ruth.
Just as you talked about the Holy Spirit driving Jesus into the wilderness, it just trotted through my brain that the other thing that is driven into the wilderness is the scapegoat. And was Jesus spending the time in the wilderness contemplating, I think Phil, it was you that said about what it means to be Jesus. Was Jesus contemplating what it means to be the scapegoat, or what it means to be the sin bearer? What would it mean? What would it mean to be God's expression in the flesh of saying that I'm not doing violence, I'm not meeting violence with violence, I will love you absolutely whatever. You can do the worst and I will not stop loving you. It was just a thought that I hadn't had while I was preparing.
Yeah, I think there's more than enough. You
can add that into your sermon, obviously.
Preaching meat. Neil's study is going to be collapsing under the weight of sheer cleverness. In this.
I need to tell the congregation that we're going to be staying a bit longer.
Well, my suspicion is that a lot of these themes will work themselves through the next few weeks of Lent as we reflect, and we might find ourselves coming back to them. And the first week of Lent is a good time to get them all out on the table. And then sensible preachers, I think, will think ahead and will think of how they're going to tell this story over a long period, rather than how am I going to do this in 15 minutes next Sunday. But anyone's up for a challenge, go for it. But there are other ways we can tell this story, and perhaps these are really deep themes that lend themselves to things that are not just words. Words are pretty poor means of communication sometimes to get across some of the deep stuff. So we're just going to share some of the ideas that we've had about other ways you can try and communicate the truth of these readings. Rachel, what have you come up with?
I was thinking of a couple of ideas that I might use if I was, if it was a kind of family service sort of context. So I would have a bag of random objects, probably try to have some amusing random objects from around my house, and get them all out of the bag sort of one by one, and, you know, talk about them a bit, and then put them all back and ask people to tell me what was in the bag and see if they could remember, you know, how much they could remember, and then quite simply then just draw it into the fact that, you know, God remembers and loves us, and that's something important for us to remember. The other thing I thought I might do with kids is make an elephant, because elephants never forget anything, of course. But I don't know if you can see my
Look at that.
There is literally just the top of a plastic milk bottle.
That is awesome.
In the house, but I did I did have to steal from my son today. And you can decorate it with tissue paper and all sorts of things. But so I thought I'd probably get them to make some elephants, maybe with a little you know, I don't know, tag or something that says "Remember, God loves you." So
that is fantastic. I'm going to cancel the glass milk delivery now and go and make some elephants.
That is awesome.
And you could, I'm thinking about Elmer the elephant, who has all sorts of colours. So you could even bring in the colours of the rainbow and decorate your little Elmer. And I love his little hat.
That's just absolutely fabulous. I used to do a thing with kids on Remembrance Sunday, as you're following this theme of remembering, aren't you? And I used to do this whole bag of stuff, random stuff from around the house, and I used to get it all out one by one and tell them to remember what was in the bag. And then I put it all back in and get the congregation to remember everything. And eventually they'd get like everything. And I said, oh, still one more thing. And they just couldn't remember it. There would always be one thing they couldn't remember. And then I'd fish out this thing that I hadn't shown them in the first place. The outrage on children, they're utterly, you do it in a school assembly, they are utterly outraged. And then we used to talk about how God, you know, how at Remembrance Sunday we're asked to remember stuff we weren't present at. And you know, God's memory is even better than ours. God can remember stuff anyway, that's a diversion, but I just love doing stuff that outrages children. They remember it for years if you do something that just pokes at their sense of fairness. It's not fair, you didn't show us that. Didn't I? Okay. Neil, what have you found?
A couple of things that I've been playing with. I mean, one is, given everything that we've been saying about these passages, I wondered, this might be a Sunday when I'd want to make use of a creed. I might want to have liturgically a statement of faith. When I was teaching at Westminster, I always used to say to students, I think it's really important at least once a year that you explore the Nature, Faith and Order statement of the URC. And of course, other fantastic statements of faith are available from other traditions. But this, because of the way in which we've touched on so many big themes, I wonder if one way of bringing that home to people, and especially if you had it available in a format that could be taken home and maybe put up on a fridge, is to have a statement of faith or a creed and say it together and just notice how we're part of a big family. And the other thing, I'm not sure, having now done a few of these, whether have I ever shared Malcolm Guite's stuff, Bill? You're like an elephant, you always remember.
I used a Malcolm Guite poem a few weeks ago for Transfiguration, but that's all right. That was Transfiguration, so go.
Well, I was simply going to just point people to this, which is Malcolm's blog. Malcolm Guite recently retired as chaplain at Girton College in Cambridge. A fabulous, I mean, he's just an amazing Anglican priest, poet, songwriter, motorbike rider, you name it. I mean, he's just incredible. But he's really generous in his blog, in that he puts up most of his poetry, and you can also then, he invariably, as well as giving you the words, he puts up a sound file of him reading his poetry. And I mean, you would need to search through to find something specifically relevant, but it's one of those blogs and one of those websites that it might well be worth dwelling on, because I think he's, particularly when we come to some of the big familiar moments of the Christian year, like Advent and Lent and Pentecost, the big festival seasons, he's really, really good at writing stuff that takes you inside it in a fresh way. And this might be a Sunday when just taking some of Malcolm's poetry could again be something that would unveil some of the depths.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think Ruth shared one of his poems, didn't you, Ruth, a couple of weeks ago? So it's always worth having a little bookmark folder of places to go for inspiration, and it's a really valuable resource to have. Ruth, what have you dug out of your closet?
Well, from the sublime to the ridiculous, really, because I was thinking about, was there an art sort of activity, thinking that if there were children present, or if you've got the sort of adults who will do something messy and reflect on it. And I remembered I used to love painting with straws. Where you put a blob of quite wet paint and then blow and it goes off. And I thought somebody must have done something with rainbows and straw painting, and indeed they have. And you kind of blob the colours in a rough rainbow paint, and then you blow to get them to spread like a rainbow, the way that the colours kind of intermingle. And I just thought that it would be worth reflecting on that, as it's not totally under your control. And I think that going back to that idea of the God who gives up control, the God, I mean, the one word I find hardest to think about with God is omnipotent, because I think God chooses not to be all powerful, that God has the power and chooses to give it up. I mean, and again, that's kind of what the whole of Lent will be telling us over and over again. So to get people to just think about, it doesn't mean it can't be beautiful, and it doesn't mean it doesn't do, it's lovely to see the colours mingle, but there's that frustration of it's not completely under your control. And sometimes the harder you try and the more you blow, the more of a mess you make of it. And if you're doing it as a group as well, and I realise that there's COVID security to think about, so I'm looking forward to a time when we can do this without people worrying, or they could do it in bubbles or whatever. But if you're doing it together, it's even worse, because somebody might be trying to blow that bit of red that way and you're trying to blow it the other way. And just as a way of reflecting on what power looks like and what it means to create without having total power over the creation. And then hopefully you would end up with something that looked beautiful and looked more like a rainbow than just if you painted it very neatly and stayed inside the lines. But it's sort of messy. And also I kind of hoped the paint might get everywhere, And but by the time you're blowing paint, you run the risk of splats up you or on other people or whatever, and it gets where you didn't mean it to be, and to kind of reflect something on the way that because God gives up absolute control, there's something about that makes it explode out and makes God's love available and makes the grace of God available to everybody. So I was looking forward to a nice messy kind of activity.
Would have been slightly more effective there, Ruth, if you had pre-prepared your sleeves and covered them in paint and just done.
Maybe I could re-record that.
Re-record that. Neil.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fabulous idea. I was just thinking, Ruth, you could, if you wanted to kind of scale it up, you could have a really large sheet of like lining paper or whatever, and use hair dryers.
Ooh.
So you could really get a lot of people involved in creating a really big rainbow mess.
Lovely.
My suspicion is it wouldn't look anything like a rainbow, but yeah. I like the idea of not being in control of it, and I think that's probably what you were getting at. I came across a fascinating article this week about the control of the rainbow, and it was talking about in Plymouth. Plymouth a few years ago commissioned a LGBT bus with the big rainbow on it, and then it was repurposed in May this year as thanks to the NHS bus. And when it first came out, when it was the LGBT bus, then Christians all got cross about it and said, "You're stealing our rainbow, it's ours," or "God's rainbow." That's the voice Christians speak on phone-ins. They're all very cross about it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then in May, when it was repurposed as the NHS bus, the LGBT community came out and said, "You're stealing our rainbow!" And I think nobody owns this symbol of hope. And I found myself going around Cranbrook looking at the rainbows in windows and marking them as to whether they got the colours right or not. And I wanted to control them because I've got the orange and the blue the wrong way around there. What's going on? Do it right. So I think that might say something. And I certainly have heard in church people being angry about the rainbow being used for other purposes. So it might have some resonance and might cause some arguments. Which isn't a bad thing, especially if you're all sat around with hair dryers and paint. Anything could happen. I had a look at a few things. I'm going to share my screen if I can remember how. Yeah, I've always told congregations when we do this Noah story that one day I will make a realistic Noah children's toy. And so I had a look on the internet for realistic Noah toy, and most of them are not realistic at all. They're just arks with animals on, except one picture that I found, which is that one there, which is kind of what I wanted to create one day. There's the ark, and it's being patrolled by a tiger to stop strays getting on. Noah and his family are all safe up there with the zebras and everything else, and everyone else is drowning, and the toddler's just enjoying himself playing with this Noah's Ark, which kind of sums up what I feel about this being a children's toy, this story. So I don't know if people want to go there or not, but it's there in the story. Like Ruth was talking about outrage at this story of what the cross means. I think we have to be prepared for outrage when we tell the story of Noah's Ark. It's genocide in a very specific and real sense of the word genocide. So yeah, there we are. That's fun for toddlers. You could do that. But then I started to think about Noah's Ark and what it might have been like. You might want to take your congregation on a journey through Noah's Ark, what it actually looks like.
It's pretty big. We're here in Northern Kentucky at the Ark Encounter, which is a full-scale replica of Noah's Ark. Here to ask the question, why? Let's get in there and check it out. Did you know there were dinosaurs on the Ark? Well, there were. Don't believe me? It's It's on the sign. We're deep in the heart of the Ark here, but as you can see, we're still no closer to finding the answer to the question, why? I found the front door. Let's take a look inside. Doesn't open. I'm here with Patrick Canusi, Director of Operations here at the Ark Encounter. And I think when you first see this Ark, it's almost baffling. It's like, why did someone build Noah's Ark in the middle of Kentucky, you know?
Right, so this attraction is really not just a story. We don't want to present the Noah story.
Right.
It is the actual biblical account of what happened.
The petting zoo here has 2 of each animals, just as God decreed it. Actually, like three more over there, so.
Right, you get the idea. I don't think he's taking it entirely seriously, but you might want to show your congregation what the result looks like. If you've got kids and you're still in a messy frame, this is a description about how to make a rainbow. You can make one yourself.
Surprise your kids by creating a real rainbow using materials you probably have on hand. There are 5 ways to create a rainbow. You can create a real rainbow outdoors. Pick a sunny area and turn your back towards the sun. Spray the water in front of you until you see a rainbow. Don't forget that the sun has to be very low in the sky, no more than 42 degrees from the skyline. Create a wonderful rainbow indoors. Slowly raise the glass of water in a sunny place until you see a rainbow on the floor. The sunlight is made up of different colors of light mixed together. A rainbow appears when the sunlight enters a water droplet and splits into many colors.
There you are, you get the idea. You can make a rainbow. And then finally, there is just a fantastic book by Stephen Cottrell, where he reflects upon a series of paintings by Stanley Spencer. I did this with a congregation a couple of years ago. He went through the book. He picks out 5 of them. But Stanley Spencer did a whole series of paintings of this Jesus in the wilderness stuff, and they're just brilliant. That's him being driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. That's Consider the Lilies. I just love the scale of these. Well, actually, these paintings are quite small. And finally, you could spend some time with Sister Wendy. So I'll stop the share. This is Stephen Cottrell's book. I don't know if that's backwards on your screen, is it? Oh no, cool, right. That's Stephen Cottrell. It's brilliant. He takes 5 things and then he has a lengthy reflections, pulling out all sorts of stuff from the imagery. The other book that I sometimes use in Lent is Sister Wendy, The Art of Lent. And she's picked out 40 works of art that take you all the way through Lent. And Sister Wendy's brilliant anyway. But it's a massively diverse collection of sort of very weird modern art stuff and very traditional oil paintings across icon. You know, she just knows everything and takes you across a huge range of stuff that's there. And I think maybe this Sunday, beginning of Lent, is a time where you might encourage your congregation into some kind of pattern, because they've got competing stuff coming at them, and people are saying, don't give something up, take something up, and all that nonsense that you get on the internet or about what you should do every day take a photograph every day. I've done that. We've all done that, haven't we? It seems to think, blimey, it's just going to be so busy doing all this stuff for Lent. So it's good to make some suggestions to your congregations about how they might connect with these themes that we've just preached on for the whole of the 40 days. Rachel.
I think there's also a book by Janet Morley that is a selection of poems for every day. There's definitely one for Advent, and I'm sure I've got the Lent one as well, but I can't remember what it's called. But but that's worth looking at. She gives a poem and then a reflection on the poem each day. I was thinking, if you wanted to get more serious with the congregation than making elephants or whatever, it might, I've already mentioned it's a week that you could sort of draw on some environmental themes. And just with you talking about the genocide in Genesis, I could think about the genocide that we're kind of currently engaged in the world in terms of sea level rise, and try and get people to imagine, because well, obviously for parts of the UK we could be underwater if sea levels rise, but actually that threat's so much more real to so many of the places in the world. So what kind of ark do we need to build to make a difference? And what would we make our ark out of? How could we change and care and do something positive to make an impact?
I think that's a really cool connection to draw, because there is a flood happening. You're right. I hadn't thought about it in those terms about how do we what would ark building look like in the 21st century. Maybe looking forward to the big conference coming up in the UK, where as Christians I suppose there will be opportunities for us to go and have our voice heard at least. There will certainly be Christian activist groups going up to the conference. There will be opportunities to be part of that, and to be part of the conversation about what ark building might look like in the face of climate change. And God has laid down her weapons, but it doesn't look like we have. This is a flood of our making. I think that's pretty deep and cool. We've got all sorts. We've got social action, we've got art, we've got craft, we've got deep theological themes, and it's just week 1 of Lent, and I don't want our preachers to feel completely overwhelmed that they have to do it all, but I hope that we have provided at least something that you can run with for this week, and maybe for the whole of your Lent series. It's a serious task that we commit ourselves to as preachers and worship leaders. Rachel's going to lead us in prayer.
Loving God, we pray for all who will be preparing to lead worship on this first Sunday of Lent. We pray for your wisdom and guidance, that you would speak to each person who will be worshipping on that day, that you will give them a reminder of your love and a challenge to look at things differently and perhaps to act differently. So, loving God, we ask that you would bless all those who will be helping your people to worship on this day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.